So Dr. Sat Dushy is a passionate medical educator with a strong belief in the use of digital technology such as gamification, virtual and augmented reality, and animation to enhance engagement online. You may know her most recent educational endeavour, the animated science YouTube channel Science in Motion. She specialises in the use of new and engaging technologies to transform education in cancer science and medicine. She led the development of the University of Melbourne and the VCCC's online Master of Cancer Sciences program, and she now works for the Centre for Digital Transformation of Health, developing professional development education programs. Today, Sat will be talking to us about her experiences taking on the biggest news stories and social media conspiracies relating to COVID-19 over the last 2 years and debunking them with scientific facts. So Sat, I will disappear and hand over to you.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Wait, let me just progress this
well, if you
slide.
think of anything that could come along,
Good afternoon, and I've been asked to talk a little about COVID conspiracy. Oh, sorry, I've just gone progressive as well. Good afternoon, everyone. I've just been asked to talk about COVID conspiracy theories and the real-life harms that they can cause, and to talk a bit about how conspiracy theories can and do impact us all in some way or another. So let's go down the rabbit hole.
Well, if you think of anything that could come along that would kill millions of people, the pandemic is our greatest risk.
The simulation estimates that a pandemic today could kill 33 million people in just 6 months.
In terms of a death toll, a pandemic would rival even the gigantic wars of the past. The economy will shut down. The cost to humanity will be unbelievable, and no country will be immune from the problem this will create.
It's hard to imagine why, conspiracy theorists believe that the pandemic was planned when videos like this circulate before events have even happened. And so that was a snippet from Vox Media's Explain Netflix series, and that aired on November 7th, 2019. And I suppose a lot of what theorists managed to connect together are really poor coincidences, and in many cases, inevitabilities. But it's a great example of how many of the conspiracy theories have come to be. And so it's always interesting to think about why people get drawn to conspiracy theories. And many studies in behavioral and social sciences have suggested that there are a number of different reasons why people believe in conspiracy theories. And many of these explanations really boil down to 3 different driving factors. One, a need for an understanding and consistency. So situations involving large-scale events where more mundane or small-scale explanations seem inadequate, or situations where people's experiences of distress and uncertainty force this. Secondly, a need for control when people feel psychologically and sociopolitically disempowered. And thirdly, a need to belong or to feel special. And so when they're on the losing side of a political issue, or they've experienced social ostracism, or they feel prejudiced towards a powerful enemy, these are really what bring out these traits. And often you find that there are these several unique traits that these theorists possess, courtesy of the crankyuncleteam.com. And they are really committed to disbelieving an official account, so much so that their beliefs often contradict. And there's a lot of suspicion that the people who are conspiring have malicious intent, for example, killing millions of people for billions of profit. And theorists always seem to see themselves as the victims or of this organized persecution, or the brave heroes that take on the villains. And the reason that it's so hard for them to challenge or change their mindset is that often their theories are self-fulfilling, and so they're immune to the evidence. For example, the absence of evidence is in itself evidence. And the reason why there is no proof is because the conspirator is so good at covering it up. And so they see these patterns everywhere, and it's a game of connect the dots. And so broadly speaking, these actors in these theories that have been classified into 7 types of personas. And hopefully throughout this talk, you will see where all of these different actors have played a role in the disinformation spread. So what are the most common conspiracy theories? A study conducted by Cornell University between January and May of 2020 at the start of the pandemic found that there were 1.3 million misinformation articles. And they found that 46% of these articles were specifically conspiracy theory related. And of the other 38%, pretty much every single one mentioned misinformation from ex-President Trump. And there's a lot more on that later. And so we'll touch on a lot of these major topics today, but what I really wanted to highlight in this graph is the vastness and the depth of the thinking that goes into these theories. So, almost 2 years into the pandemic, we still find ourselves battling not only the virus, but also wild misinformation and far more seriously, rampant conspiracy theories. But conspiracy theories and anti-vax movements are hardly new. There was immediate opposition to smallpox vaccine. There was widespread protests against the mask during the 1912 flu pandemic. In the mid-1970s, there were claims that the DTP vaccine caused neurological conditions, and this led to a lawsuit against vaccine manufacturers. Then during the next 10 years, it caused a spike in the price of the vaccine. Vaccination rates dropped. The incidence of whooping cough was 10 to 100 times higher than in countries where there was no anti-DTP movement. And so, of course, we all know the tale of Andrew Wakefield, who in 1998 published a paper arguing a connection between the MMR vaccine and autism. And after a series of exposés showing the serious flaws in the methodology of the paper, as well as the fact that Wakefield had been paid to produce evidence in a class action suit against the vaccine manufacturers, the Lancet finally withdrew the paper in 2010, and Wakefield was cancelled. But it was too late to prevent that 8% drop in the MMR vaccination that happened between 1996 and 2002, as well as the idea being popularized by celebrities like the American model, actress, and presenter Jenny McCarthy. But in today's society, where social platforms enable with such ease conspiracy theorists to get together and to form these communities around the world and to organize demonstrations and plan these attacks with little to no regulation, the internet has really given life to a whole new set of actors in the last 10 years. And so, let's talk about 5G. 5G has been one of the biggest conspiracy theories over the last 2 years. And while it's scientifically impossible for a biological viral particle to spread through an electromagnetic spectrum, conspiracy theorists thrive because they often find ways to link two things. And in this instance, it might appear that they are correlated because the rapid rollout of the 5G network was taking place at the same time that the pandemic hit. But, there are many countries where the pandemic hit and there was no 5G network. So, And so here's this interesting study by the Pew Research Center, who surveyed US adults throughout 2020, and they looked at a number of different things, but this particular example is showing what platforms people were using to get their political news. And sadly, closely to 20% of people were getting it from social media, and they believed that there was a connection between 5G and the virus. And so just to show that this is not just a problem in the US, here is a survey from France where they looked at articles shared on social media, and 81% of those articles had disinformation that 5G was causing the pandemic. And this extreme fear led to numerous phone towers being burned down during the pandemic. And in a number of countries, it really led to a very visceral reaction to something that is so implausible. And so now we move on to Mr. Gates. And, there have been so many plots and subplots that involve Bill Gates. And this is really where the Internet of Things becomes a huge burden. A video from 2015 resurfaced from a TED Talk that Gates gave, where he discussed the Ebola outbreak and warned of a new pandemic. And this really bolstered claims that he had foreknowledge of the pandemic and that he even purposefully caused it. And then, there's a lot of other theories that COVID was a plot to vaccinate the population with microchips to control the population. And, this led to lots of protests around the world and the idea of freedom of choice. And then even while the conspiracy was that COVID-19 doesn't even exist, and it was a plot by deep state global elites to take away freedoms. And so even in the US, Dr. Fauci was alleged to be a member of this secret society. And similarly, some believe that the COVID plot was a scheme by Big Pharma to make people ill and to sell these so-called quack medications. And even now, some people believe that it's no different from the flu and that the fatalities around the world are really inflated. I think in reality, it's probably more likely that the death toll is highly understated, particularly in third world countries. Then there was a theory that, the virus was released or escaped from a laboratory in Wuhan, China. And one of this is slightly more plausible because I guess, some of the facts in this are actually true. But at this point in time, it still appears to be that it's purely coincidental because despite the WHO and others like US intelligence conducting physical inquiries, they still have not found any evidence to support the theory. But they did ask for better cooperation from China in terms of sharing of raw data. But at this particular time, it was true that there was a level 4 lab who was doing gain of function studies on various dangerous pathogens to prepare for a future pandemic ever since SARS had occurred. And another variant of this conspiracy was that coronavirus was released intentionally as a weapon of biological warfare. And because of the known political tensions between China and countries like the US, these theories really seemed plausible and really became propaganda. And President Trump himself was seen on many occasions referring to COVID as the China virus. But since this time, genetic sequencing of the coronavirus genome has proven that it is a naturally occurring zoonotic origin and not a laboratory construct or purposefully weaponized. And so this survey of the American population showed where they got their news from. And of the people who got it on social media, 3 out of 10 people believe that it was lab made. And so these theories were highly perpetuated by right-wing conservatives in the news media in the US. And Trump's use of the Chinese virus terminology really encouraged this use of hate speech in the US. But also globally, since February 2020, people of Asian descent around the world have really been subjected to attacks, beatings, violent bullying, threats, racist abuse, and discrimination that all appear to be linked to the pandemic. And so here's an article that actually just came out a few days ago on November 19th, 2021, where they talked about how scientists have combed through the laboratory records, hospital records, media reports, and other databases to look at where the earliest reports of COVID actually came from. And the first known case now seems to be a seafood vendor in Wuhan, in the Wuhan market. Whereas previously it was thought to be a man who had lived 30 kilometers away from the market who had never actually been to the wet market. And hence why all of these theories around lab leaks of the virus began to spread like wildfire. But around the world, evolutionary biologists and scientists are really still racing to figure out the actual origin of this disease because it's not a blame game, but it's more about understanding what happened to ensure that we properly are armed in the event that such an occurrence happens again. And so here is some research about conspiracy theories that the pandemic was planned. 36% of US adults believe that it probably was true, which is a little bit worrying. And most of these people did get their news through social media. I'm just going to skip through some of these. And this was a really interesting movement. Those who believed that it was all a hoax started a hashtag, Film Your Hospital. And it really encouraged people to record videos of themselves in seemingly empty or less than crowded hospitals to prove that the pandemic was in fact a hoax. And there were many videos floating around showing empty corridors and wards that didn't have very many people in it. And it was really promoted by the right-wing conspiracy theory of fear-mongering by media outlets, and that Democrats were intentionally exaggerating the death toll to disrupt President Trump's campaign. And so this study shows the number of tweets with the Film Your Hospital hashtag. And so they collected about 100,000 posts from 43,000 unique users. And the researchers really wanted to know who was behind the retweets that formed the most interactions. And to answer this question, they examined the most active accounts in this network and the most frequently used keywords in the account bios. A majority of those users who posted the tweets using that hashtag were self-described Trump supporters who used words and hashtags like MAGA, Keep America Great Again, and Trump 2020. And so next we move on to the theory around miracle cures. which were by far the most prevalent conspiracy theories and disinformation that were definitely, in my opinion, exacerbated by President Trump, who knowingly advocated for treatments like hydroxychloroquine and treatments being for COVID-19 that weren't peer-reviewed at the time or found any efficacy in the data for treating people suffering from the disease. And so in this graph, you can see the spikes of the blue lines, which represent Google searches around the periods of time where Trump urged people to take unproven drugs or suggested infecting disinfectant as a cure for COVID-19. And so, these misinformation posts really led to, in the very early stages of the pandemic, deaths in about 800 people, and who even knows how many more after that. And we saw everything from, drinking methanol to alcohol-based cleaning products in some countries. And this was really interesting. At the peak of Sydney's outbreak in September this year, hospitals were seeing people presenting in the emergency ward after self-medicating with ivermectin, which you heard a lot about yesterday, and other drugs that had been ordered online. And so people were sharing on anti-vaccination groups information about sympathetic doctors who would provide prescriptions or ways to obtain the drug from international stores, and also telling people how to administer this version of the drug, which was really designed for deworming of livestock. And so this graph shows the number of articles that were published whenever Trump said something controversial. And what it really highlights is that the media were as much infatuated with Trump as he sought the attention from them. And so during these periods, increased numbers of calls to US Poisons Information Hotline prompted the FDA to tell people to stop taking these drugs that weren't approved. And probably the most unbelievable story that I still cannot get my head around today is where at the point towards the end of the US election last year, Trump contracted COVID and was cured within 3 days using a concoction of trial drugs. And he addressed this in a Twitter video where he claimed that China would pay a huge price for what they'd done to the United States. And many believe that this was a ploy because he had a terrible performance at the debate, and it was to redirect attention and gain votes. And at this time, he also told people not to fear the virus. And so this next one's really around the theory of vaccines and infertility, which has been floating around for a while. The initial trials did not have pregnant women as participants because the safety of the participants comes first. And so using pregnant women for no reason wasn't really something that you do in trials. And because of the unknown effects on pregnancy, many women who were either considering conceiving or had become wary, or was going to conceive, were becoming wary of taking the vaccine. And an ex-employee from Pfizer posted this terrible misinformation that the spike protein in the vaccine contained a genetic sequence which was shared with placental proteins. And they basically said that this would cause a protein of antibodies to attack the placenta and cause miscarriage and infertility. And this was completely false. The amount of shared amino acid between the spike protein and the protein in the placenta is so minimal that there's no way that antibodies would ever form and cause an immune attack against the placenta. And protein chemists around the world have confirmed this, but nonetheless, it led to much anxiety and distress in the choice to get vaccinated for many women and children of childbearing years. Similarly, a very, very rare side effect were reported in males where there were symptoms of inflamed testicles, but this information in the wrong hands with people who have large amounts of social media presence can lead to extreme harm. And so rapper Nicki Minaj famously tweeted this post about her cousin who was experiencing inflamed testicles. And, in showing this to her millions of followers, you can only imagine what diehard fans would do or believe as a result. And similarly, it just goes to show, I guess, how much power extreme views have when held in the hands of high-profile celebrities. So for many anti-vaxxers, it was the theory that this new mRNA-based vaccines were able to alter your DNA, and that would prevent them from getting vaccinated. And it was the idea that this new untested technology was targeting people's DNA, and this led to viral theories about governments and elite wanting to try to control mankind. There's unambiguous science that shows that no genetic material from a vaccine enters the nucleus of a cell, which is where you find the DNA. The vaccine material really stays inside the cytoplasm and it's transcribed into a spike protein here, and it then goes onto the surface of the cell to be detected by immune cells and cause an immune response. In reality, the science just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And given that it was a global pandemic, regulatory approval processes, which were normally unnecessarily lengthy and bureaucratic, were fast-tracked to serve the greater good. But this speed of discovery is what led to the distrust amongst the public and fears around safety and long-term effects. And the argument that not enough time has passed to know if there are long-term side effects doesn't really play out, because in most trials, in reality, all vaccine studies have previously shown adverse effects within the first 2 to 3 months. And so we are well beyond this window now in terms of understanding vaccine safety. And just to highlight, I guess, extremist views from conspiracy theorists, this is a comment that I got the other day from my channel, which was debunking the altered DNA theory. You are the misinformation. No explanation as to why, just a fact, apparently. What was really interesting when I was doing this research is during the pandemic, there were several different social media moments, like when Taylor Swift announced that she would air her concert on television, the Office cast reunited, the Pentagon posted videos about phenomenons, but none of that was able to combat the amount of posts that occurred around this video that was released about the pandemic, which was called the Plandemic. It was a 26-minute video which had all these false claims about shadowy cabal of elites who were using the virus as a potential vaccine to profit and gain power. In the video, they further argue that wearing masks activates coronavirus. And they also pushed a pseudoscience around treatments of alternative medicines, such as healing microbes that are found in the ocean. And over just a week after the release, it had been viewed over 8 million times. And so this is an interesting graphic. It's a retweet network graphic from the University of Washington. And it shows how the pandemic conspiracy video spread over Twitter. Each of these circles account for a particular account, and the size is proportional to how many retweets it had. And the accounts are categorized based on their profile descriptions. And so they were pro-Trump, far-right, conspiracy theory, or anti-vax. But it really shows you what groups were reposting this kind of information and how far the information spread. And I feel like I've been a bit down on social media over the course of this talk, so I just want to give it a little bit of credit. They definitely have not just been sitting around doing nothing. I guess they are doing some things. Whether they could be doing more is debatable. But for an example, recently YouTube agreed that they would remove any vaccine misinformation videos. WhatsApp talked about making stricter limits on how many times you can forward something. And Google announced a policy against misinformation as well. And so I guess what I really wanted to end on is something that's been happening, I guess, very much in Australia, but around the world, particularly in Melbourne, is these pandemic and vaccine mandate protests. And so this is Parliament House yesterday, where despite 2 years of a pandemic, numerous lives lost, significant illness, economies being shut down, and people's livelihoods being toppled, people still believe that the pandemic laws are a coordinated plan to control individuals. And their signs included everything from anti-government to anti-vaccine mandate slogans. And it's clear that this situation is a changing and evolving one every day. And much like how individuals are entitled to change their opinion and their mind, so is science and government too, because they have to be able to pivot strategies and be prepared in light of new and ever-changing evidence. And in 2021, I don't think anyone really wants anti-freedom. But we're in a time where there are far, far more pressing issues at hand, like climate change, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, LGBTIQA+ equality and rights, and getting vaccines to underprivileged nations to fight disease. that there's hardly room for this kind of new age misguided hatred and violence to rise and consume our lives. I think what we need right now is some calm.
Oh, here, couldn't agree more. Thank you, Sat. That was fantastic. I certainly think that there is so much noise being made and kind of misdirection that we really are being drawn away from the really important stuff we should be focusing on. That's a really, really great point. So we've had some questions come in. I'll start with this one from Mark Honeychurch. How do you personally cope with people sending you horrible comments online? Do you try to engage with them or just ignore them? Do you delete their comments?
Yeah, I mostly just delete them. I feel like engaging with them never results in anything good because, as I said, they're very fixed in their views and it's very hard to change their mind. They're not like people who are just, misinformed by looking at misinformation, disinformation. They're people who've really thought through what they believe in, and they're in these closed groups that we can't see, and there's a lot of them. And I feel like violence sort of just breeds more violence in these situations, and it's better not to engage.
That's quite interesting because, I've noticed, in the past when I've spoken to people who kind of get into these debates on Twitter, which I tend to think really are a waste of time, people often say that they will engage not for the person they're arguing with, but for the people watching. Do you think there's any value in that, or?
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. I suppose it is the voice of the majority that you're able to provide, which is a really good thing. But I think it's also about choosing your battles, and it very much comes down to what that person has said, whether there is any opportunity in there in what they've said to start a conversation, or whether it's just like hatred and they just want to voice their opinion. So I think it really comes down to a case-by-case basis, but definitely I think it's much easier to talk to people who are misinformed than it is to talk to people who are real, true conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, absolutely. A question from Tim Mendham. Has the fear of the impact of misinformation been ameliorated by the current vaccine take-up? Nothing like a real threat to counter false information.
You would have thought so, but then why are there still like hundreds of thousands of people protesting around the world about anti-vaccine mandates and this kind of thing? I feel like maybe the people who were a little bit confused or were reading the wrong things, who weren't sure, have been tipped in the right direction, or sorry, the direction of the majority. But I feel like those people who have such strong beliefs have not changed their minds, in my opinion.
Okay, last question from Madeline R. I think people tend to believe multiple unrelated conspiracies. Why can't we put design around the truth that makes it palatable to pattern recognition by conspiracists?
That's a good question, and probably a question more for people who are involved in AI and machine learning than me. But I think it's that idea of people who believe in one conspiracy are more likely to believe in other conspiracy theories. They're sort of predisposed to that because of their beliefs, what they've been exposed to, the way they've been treated. And so they really do go down this rabbit hole, and the social media algorithms help them in that rabbit hole of taking them further and further down videos which are related to what they've already watched or posts they've already seen. So it's kind of a vicious cycle, which is very hard to, I think, now change, especially in this world where we have social media that is unregulated or not able to be reached in these closed groups and in Telegram, people's personal messages. It's very hard to get to those places where a lot of these forwards and stuff are happening with all of this disinformation.
Absolutely. And out of interest, how much of what you were seeing there were you able to see was being driven by bots, pushing out that information versus sort of real accounts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not really sure. I think it's hard to determine which is which at this point, because I feel like the algorithms have become so intelligent, they look like people, they've really taken on a life of their own. So I think it's hard to say which is which now.
Gosh, that is disturbing. All right, well, look, thank you so much. We've come to the end of the questions. We really appreciate you giving your time for addressing this topic. And well and truly, COVID has infected this convention.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sat.